Hi, welcome to Gospel with Greg, and this video is the first video in a series I'm doing within Gospel with Greg called Historical Thinking. This taps a lot into my history knowledge that I have. I did another video series called Historical Methods, where in a few videos I talk about different methods that historians use to study history, kind of broke those down a bit and talked about how we can apply each to the historical study of Christianity to show the authenticity and truth of the Christian faith. And so in this series I really want to show how historical thinking and Christian thinking are very compatible, and I'm going to hit hard on that in this first video as kind of an introduction to it. So this is going to kind of be themed like being a Christian and being a historian, addressing that. And so what I specifically want to address is this idea that some have that faith and scholarship are contradictory. So the idea that, a devout Christian cannot be a good scholar. They say they're just too contradictory. So I want to show that that is not the case in this video. So up here at the top in the red, the learning objective for this video is recognizing the compatibility of historical thinking and Christian thought. And so the first thing to cover that we'll cover in this video is really a couple important terms of what is history. And so first big thing to know and to recognize is that the terms history and the past are not the exact same. They're not exact synonyms. So when we look at our definitions here, first, the definition for the past that we'll be using is all previous events prior to the current moment. So basically, everything that has ever happened before right now, that's the past. Pretty broad term. History is more specialized and specific. So when we look at the definition for that is history is the study of the recorded human past primarily through written records. And you do find some variations, exceptions to that. So there is such a thing as oral history of people verbally talking about historical events they've lived through, which can be written down in a transcript later, or oral tradition where stories about the past are passed down verbally from generation to generation. You might find that just as an example in Native American tribes, stories about their past and their history. But regardless, history is the recorded human past. And so this is more, it's part of the past, but again, more specific, more specialized. So keep this in mind when we're talking about history in this video and the subsequent videos. This is what we're going to be dealing with here. And so this leads us into the question that this video kind of hinges on, of this question of bias. And that is what a lot of critics will lodge at Christians and Christian historians, is that we're just too biased. Scholarship and being a historian requires that you're completely objective, that you put these biases on the shelf, and the thinking goes that Christians just can't do that. Well, something that is important to remember is that everyone is biased about something. We all have bias, not just Christians. And really some bias is really unknown or unconscious bias. I took a sociology course as an undergraduate when I was in college for my first degree, and so it talked about some of that, of how we are influenced by our society and culture in ways that we're not even aware of, and so we have to keep that in mind when it comes to this question of bias, is that we all have it. So if literal zero bias, none whatsoever, was the requirement to be a historian, well, I think the field's about to be a lost art, because nobody really fits that. And so that's important to remember here. But of course, historians are encouraged to try to avoid judging history by today's standards. That's something that I was trained to keep in mind in college as well, is that it can be tempting that when we see historical figures doing things that are very taboo today, it can be easy to quickly condemn them. And maybe from a moral standpoint, it is kind of like, wow, that was egregious. But we have to think about them and what they did, our historical analysis, in terms of what was the time and the culture they were operating in. So, for instance, today we agree, most of us agree, thankfully, that things like slavery is wrong. And so when we look back at historical figures that owned slaves, that is quite egregious to us. But historically speaking, we shouldn't draw these lines of George Washington and Hitler are basically the exact same. You have racism involved and prejudice involved in both, and suppression and all that. That's not, in terms of, being a good historian, that's not a good way to look at it. You have to think of the context of things, of, with Washington, using that example, Washington's slavery, again, yes, from current morals and from a Christian standpoint, bad that he did that, but we have to consider the fact that Washington wasn't the only one who owned slaves during that time, so we have to keep that in mind when we're doing our historical analysis and our scholarship of him, because it would be incorrect to treat him like he was the only one doing that during his time. And so definitely have to keep that in mind. And that another thing to remember with bias, again, we should try to not judge history by current ideas and current society, but we're all impacted by bias. We all have bias, and that's important to remember when addressing this question of, are Christians too biased to be good historians? Well, people of other worldviews can also impute biases on historical interpretation and analysis in ways that people say that Christians do. So, for instance, atheist historians might appeal to modern philosophy of miracles aren't real to dismiss the resurrection of Jesus. So that kind of violates this of try to avoid judging history by today's standards. Now, of course, some people are going to say to that of, oh, well, we've developed, new ideas in science, and, can't you keep that in mind when studying history? Well, it's certainly true that sometimes cross-disciplinary approaches can be helpful. Sometimes historians and scholars might do a cross-disciplinary approach with, say, archaeology. Archaeology's study of history, or study of the human past, through physical remains primarily, so some overlap with history. But if you're in a context where maybe written sources are lacking, it can be helpful to have a cross-disciplinary approach of history and archaeology. But I don't think that is a good parallel with this, because this idea of, miracles don't happen, so the resurrection of Christ didn't happen. It's not the best explanation of the facts. That, I would say, is not a good scholarly cross-disciplinary methodology to use, because that's not tapping into, say, a hard science that you are, mixing with your history approach. That's more of a philosophical idea that you're mixing in there, because you can't necessarily do an experiment to show that miracles are impossible. And so that kind of idea from an atheist historian, to just assume, can't happen, resurrection of Christ can't happen, miracles don't happen, that is the same kind of bias that secular critics accuse Christians of. So it can go either way. Again, we're all affected by bias, so we shouldn't act like this is something that just Christians have to keep in mind. And so really, when you look at this, this ties into starting and doing historical research, kind of what's involved with that. So when you do historical research, if you're doing a history research project, you're going to have, particularly if it's a big one, you're going to have a thesis. I have a definition of that here. And so your thesis is what you're arguing and what your research is going to prove. And that can change in light of evidence, but you do tend to develop that towards the beginning of your research. So if you've ever read a history book that has a thesis, maybe in the introduction of this research will show whatever it is, you might think that they did all the research first, and then once they did all the research, then they sat and thought, okay, what's the argument here? You don't really have that with historical research. Typically, you are going to have a thesis towards the beginning of the research. Maybe you do a little bit of research first, but you tend to have this thesis in mind as you do the research. And of course it can change in light of new evidence, and of course it should, if the evidence shows that what your argument is looks like it's false or a little bit off, and in that case you would modify it, because you don't want to say, all the sources disagree with my argument, let's see how we can bend that. No, you are gonna modify it if necessary, but the point is you have that thesis in mind towards the beginning of the research and kind of throughout the process. You also have your research questions along with that, and so the research questions are going to be the questions your research will answer, and so that's going to frame your research. And so if you are doing something like research project on the Civil War, let's say you pick a Civil War Battle of Gettysburg, for example, there's a lot you could do with that. If you're doing that research project on the Battle of Gettysburg, and so your research questions can be something along the lines of what factors caused the Battle of Gettysburg to occur, or maybe specifically to occur when it did. What factors aided the winning side to ultimately win the battle, things like that. And so again, that frames it down, kind of contextualizes what the research is. So maybe you are talking about the battle in general, but these research questions are going to narrow it down to, okay, but we're specifically going to look at the causes here, or specifically what contributed to the victory, things like that. And of course that ties into the thesis. So you might have your research questions pertaining to what caused the winning side to win. Your thesis is, this is what caused them to win, or these factors caused them to win. And again, these kinds of questions are things you really want to think about towards the beginning of the research, especially since it's going to frame it, because you want to have some kind of lens, some kind of guide as you're reading through the source material to do the research. And so this brings us to the methodology in the historical research you're doing. And so methodology encompasses several different things. So that's going to be, what sources are you looking at? Are you going to look at diaries, using the Civil War example? Are you going to use the diaries of soldiers? Are you going to use newspapers from the time? What did newspapers have to say about it? Are you going to use modern scholarly sources? You might use that to kind of help you get a head start. If there are certain scholars who've written something about Civil War battles or the Battle of Gettysburg, you might read that, and that can kind of get you on a good start. Also, what focus? Is it going to be military history, political history, cultural, intellectual, things like that? How will you collect the data? Are you going to do any interviews? That's going to be relevant, particularly if it's more modern, more recent history. So, for instance, with Civil War research, there are no living Civil War veterans for you to sit down and talk to, but if you're doing research on the Vietnam War, there are plenty of Vietnam veterans who are still alive that potentially you could sit down for an oral history interview with them, ask them questions about their experience, and you could then transcribe that into a written source that you can use. And so your methodology, these various aspects, that's going to be determined by what the topic is. And so those are things to keep in mind. And when it comes to Christian historians, considering these different factors, we can see that Christian historians can use the resurrection as their thesis and kind of what they're testing, and stick with that if the evidence backs it up. And so we can see the Bible's thesis being, there are several different verses you can look at, but we see a very prominent example in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 14. This is written by Paul. It says, "And if Christ be not risen, then is our preaching vain, and your faith is also vain." So when we look at the Bible, New Testament in particular, we see that the central historical claim of Christianity and the Bible is that Christ rose from the dead after being crucified, where he died for our sins, as the divine Son of God. So the resurrection is really, you could say, is Christianity and the Bible's thesis. And so Christian historians, if they are specifically doing research on the resurrection of Jesus or Christianity, things like that, the resurrection is the thesis. and so we can treat it as the thesis and stick with that, again, if the evidence backs it up. And I have other videos I've done, like the Historical Methods series, and also my video, Historical Evidence for the Resurrection, to show that there is sufficient evidence to show that the resurrection did occur. And so I mentioned here that when talking about the thesis, that if the evidence shows that your initial thesis is incorrect, you would modify that. And we see examples of non-Christians investigating Christianity and ultimately changing their position. Their thesis was that the resurrection didn't happen, but as they looked at the evidence, they had to change their thesis and say, actually, yes, the resurrection did happen, Christianity is true. So we see some examples like Lee Strobel, author of The Case for Christ, also Nabil Qureshi, who wrote Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, and also Abdu Murray. He was, along with Nabil Qureshi, was a Muslim who converted to Christianity. You can find some great work by all of them online, as well as books that they've written. And so the last point to finish on is how Christianity and being a Christian actually encourages good historical thinking. So this idea, again, that being a Christian causes you to think in a way that's not conducive to being a scholar. Actually, we can see the opposite when we look at the Bible and certain factors for maybe people who have a Christian background. So when we look at the Bible itself, the Bible is a collection of multiple sources, so that kind of trains Christians to think, as they're studying the Bible, of consulting this collection of multiple texts to see what happened. Also, primary and secondary sources. I have a video in my Historical Methods series where I talk about that. What those are: primary eyewitness accounts, secondary sources being secondary second-hand accounts. So we have both of those in the Bible. Also, oral history. We see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 6, where Paul says the following. He's listing off different people who saw the risen Christ, and in verse 6, he says, "After that he was seen of above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto this present, but some are fallen asleep." So he's saying several of these people in this group of 500 that saw Jesus are still alive. You can go ask them. You can hear their oral history accounts, them saying verbally what historic event they lived through. So we have that. And also oral tradition, things like Moses writing down the Genesis creation account. Moses, of course, wasn't there when God created the world, but you certainly have that story passed down verbally throughout the generations between creation and the time of Moses. So that definitely has an oral tradition flavor to it. And then when it comes to studying the Bible, Christians are encouraged to not take verses out of context, to read the context of around the verse to see what it is, and then also to think about historical context as well. If Jesus is talking about things that reference Jewish practices, Christians are definitely encouraged to think about that in their interpretation, and not strictly think of everything Jesus said and did in terms of the 21st century United States. We're encouraged to remember that this is first century Middle East. So several different ways that being a Christian can encourage good historical thinking. So I hope this video was informative for those of you watching. Very much appreciate the time and attention you gave to watch this video. And so the overall takeaway is that Christian thought and historical thinking are quite compatible and can be quite conducive to one another, which is something I hope to further show in the subsequent videos in this series. Thank you again for watching. Until next time, God bless.